The year was 2016. The city was Havana, a place of faded grandeur and slow, humid nights. Relations between the United States and Cuba were thawing, a diplomatic spring after decades of icy silence. American diplomats and intelligence officers had returned to the embassy, a concrete bastion overlooking the Malecon. They worked to rebuild bridges, to untangle a complex history. But something else was waiting for them in the tropical air, something unseen and unheard by most. It began subtly. A single officer, working late in their diplomatic residence, first noticed it. A sound, not a familiar sound. It was a high-pitched, directional beam of noise, a piercing metallic shriek that seemed to grind against the very fabric of the night. This was no ordinary city noise. It wasn't the distant rumble of a vintage car or the rhythm of a late-night salsa band drifting from a nearby club. This was something else entirely. It was invasive. It bored into the skull. The officer described it as a bizarre, mechanical cricket, but one of immense power and malevolence. It pulsed with an unnerving rhythm, seeming to follow them as they moved from room to room. When they stepped outside, into the humid embrace of the garden, the sound vanished. Back inside, it returned, a relentless, invisible tormentor. This was not a haunting in the traditional sense, but it felt like one. A modern ghost, born of technology and malice, had taken up residence. The officer was not alone for long. Soon others began to report the same phenomenon. The accounts were strikingly similar, yet deeply personal. One described a low, humming vibration that seemed to make the very air in the room feel heavy, like a physical pressure against their eardrums. Another spoke of a buffeting sensation, as if they were standing in a powerful, silent wind that only they could feel. These experiences were confined to their homes or specific hotel rooms. The strangeness was its precision. A spouse sleeping in the same bed might hear nothing at all, while their partner writhed in auditory agony. The phenomenon seemed to have a target. It was a sniper's bullet made of sound. The initial confusion quickly curdled into fear. These were not men and women easily spooked. They were seasoned intelligence officers, diplomats and security personnel trained to operate in hostile environments. They were accustomed to surveillance, to pressure, to the subtle games of international espionage. But this was different. This was an attack on the senses, an assault on the sanctity of their private spaces. The enemy was invisible. The weapon was silent to all but its victim. The nights in Havana, once filled with the promise of new diplomacy, now held a creeping dread. Something was terribly wrong, and no one knew what it was. The horror had begun. The sounds were just the beginning. The true horror of the phenomenon revealed itself in the hours and days that followed the exposure. The invisible assault left a brutal physical calling card. Victims who had endured the high-frequency shriek or the low, vibrating hum began to experience a cascade of debilitating symptoms. It was a cruel and varied symphony of sickness. Intense headaches would bloom behind the eyes, a crushing pressure that no medicine could touch. Waves of nausea would sweep over them, accompanied by bouts of dizziness so severe that standing upright became a monumental task. The world would tilt and spin, a disorienting vertigo that made the simplest actions feel treacherous. These were not the symptoms of a common illness. They were sharp, sudden, and profoundly disorienting. Personnel, once at the peak of their physical and mental abilities, found themselves struggling. They reported problems with balance, a strange fogginess of thought that clouded their judgment and slowed their reactions. The world, once sharp and clear, now seemed muffled and distant. It was as if a veil had been dropped between their minds and reality. One officer described the feeling as being perpetually concussed, as if they had suffered a severe blow to the head, yet there was no impact, no bruise, no external sign of injury. The wound was internal, unseen, and deeply unnerving. The psychological toll was just as severe. Memory became a treacherous landscape. Victims would forget common words, lose their train of thought mid-sentence, or struggle to recall recent events. This cognitive decline was terrifying for individuals whose careers depended on their sharp intellect and powers of recall. The persistent auditory phenomena were followed by tinnitus, a constant ringing in the ears that became a permanent reminder of the initial attack. This phantom sound was a ghost that never left, a maddening hum that filled every moment of silence. Sleep offered no escape, as the nights were often plagued by insomnia and a pervasive sense of anxiety. The symptoms lingered. For some, they became chronic. The initial acute phase would subside, but a constellation of problems remained. Persistent headaches, cognitive difficulties, and a constant feeling of unease became the new normal. The invisible injury had left a permanent scar. Diplomats and spies, once confident and capable, were now patients, navigating a labyrinth of medical appointments and unanswered questions. Their lives, both professional and personal, had been irrevocably altered. The horror was not just in the initial attack, but in its relentless, unending aftermath. They were the walking wounded from a battle they never saw. When the afflicted personnel were evacuated from Havana and subjected to intensive medical examination, the mystery only deepened. Doctors at the University of Pennsylvania and other leading institutions were faced with a puzzle unlike any they had encountered before. The patient's symptoms were real, debilitating, and consistent. They described pain, dizziness, cognitive fog, and hearing loss. Yet the initial tests were bewilderingly inconclusive. Standard MRI scans of their brains appeared normal. Blood tests showed no signs of infection or exposure to known toxins. There was no clear single phantom footprint that could explain the diverse and severe array of ailments. Physicians were forced to look deeper, employing more advanced neuroimaging techniques. It was here that the first whispers of a physical trace emerged. Studies using diffusion tensor imaging, a method that maps the brain's white matter tracts, began to show subtle but significant differences. In a group of affected diplomats, researchers found evidence of widespread changes in the white matter, the brain's intricate network of nerve fibers that act as its communication grid. The connectivity between different brain regions, particularly those related to auditory and visuospatial functions, appeared to be diminished. It was as if the wiring itself had been damaged. The findings were controversial and hotly debated within the medical community. The changes were subtle, and some critics argued they could fall within the range of normal human variation or be the result of pre-existing conditions. However, the consistency of the findings across a cohort of patients who had all reported similar environmental exposures was compelling. The medical reports from this period are filled with careful, cautious language, but the underlying implication was startling. These patients exhibited brain abnormalities similar to those seen in individuals who had suffered a mild traumatic brain injury, like a concussion from a car accident or a blast wave. One declassified medical summary from 2018 states, "The clinical findings are reminiscent of persistent concussion syndrome, yet there is no history of head trauma." This single sentence captures the heart of the enigma. The patients had the injuries of a physical blow, but no blow had ever been struck. It suggested that some external force, some directed energy, had managed to bypass the skull and directly interact with the delicate tissues of the brain. The medical evidence did not solve the mystery. Instead, it made it even more terrifying. It provided a clinical name for the haunting, transforming it from a collection of strange experiences into a documented physical injury of unknown origin. As the number of victims grew, the United States government began a quiet, frantic investigation. Behind the scenes, a flurry of classified cables and internal memos circulated between the State Department, the CIA, and the FBI. When fragments of these documents were later declassified and released to the public, they painted a picture of an administration grappling with a threat it could not comprehend. The pages were a sea of black ink, with entire paragraphs and pages redacted. These blacked-out sections became as much a part of the story as the words left behind, hinting at secrets too sensitive to reveal. What was hidden in those dark rectangles? Names of suspects, details of the technology, the full, terrifying extent of the damage. The visible text, however, was chilling enough. Early communications revealed a state of confusion and disbelief. Memos described the symptoms in stark detail, compiling a growing list of personnel affected. The term health attacks became the official nomenclature. A 2017 State Department cable speaks of a targeted phenomenon, noting the lack of acoustic evidence in the environment, meaning no audible sound could be recorded by standard equipment, even as the victims were experiencing it. This suggested a weapon of incredible sophistication, one that could project sound or energy into a person's head without leaving a trace in the surrounding room. The documents were a formal record of institutional paranoia. One of the most unsettling revelations from the declassified files was a recording. The Associated Press obtained a sound file that several of the victims in Havana claimed was similar to what they had heard. It is a deeply unnatural sound, a high-frequency, multi-toned shriek that seems to pulse and waver. It is not a cricket. It is not a faulty electrical device. It is a grating, nails-on-a-chalkboard sound that seems scientifically engineered to cause distress. Listening to the recording, even at a safe volume, is an unpleasant experience. To imagine that sound beamed directly into one's skull at a high intensity is to imagine a form of modern torture. The documents also reveal the internal debate and the desperate search for answers. Memos detail the sweeping of embassies for listening devices, the installation of new security measures, and the deployment of technical experts to try and capture the signal. None of it worked. The thing, whatever it was, remained elusive. The redacted documents became a symbol of the mystery itself. They were a testament to a government that knew it was under attack, but was powerless to identify the enemy or the weapon. The black ink was not just hiding information. It was concealing a terrifying void of knowledge. The truth was in there somewhere, but it was locked away, leaving only whispers and shadows. In the frantic search for an explanation, one theory quickly gained prominence: the sonic weapon. The idea seemed to leap from the pages of a science fiction novel, yet it fit the bizarre circumstances with an unsettling neatness. The core concept was that the diplomats were being targeted by a device capable of projecting focused beams of acoustic energy. This could be either in the infrasound range, which is below the threshold of human hearing, or the ultrasound range, which is above it. Such waves, while not heard in the traditional sense, could still interact with the body, causing vibrations and pressure changes in the soft tissues of the ear and brain. This theory explained many of the strangest elements of the incidents. It accounted for the directional nature of the phenomenon, why one person could be affected while another just feet away felt nothing. A focused beam of energy would act like a spotlight of sound. It also explained the lack of recordable noise. If the primary damaging agent was outside the normal audible spectrum, standard microphones would never pick it up. The high-pitched shriek heard by victims could be a secondary effect, a byproduct of the energy interacting with electronics in the room or even with the human ear itself, a phenomenon known as the fray effect, where microwaves can create the illusion of sound inside the head. The sonic weapon theory pointed toward a state-level adversary. Developing and deploying such a weapon would require significant resources and technical expertise. Suspicion immediately fell on hostile intelligence services. Could this be a new form of harassment or espionage? Perhaps the goal was not to kill, but to injure, to drive American personnel out of a strategic location like Havana. It was a deniable attack, a way to inflict harm without firing a shot, leaving behind only confusion and a trail of broken health. The idea was that this was a new front in the shadowy world of spy versus spy conflict. However, the sonic weapon hypothesis was not without its problems. Physicists and acoustics experts raised doubts. To deliver enough energy to cause the kind of brain damage suggested by the medical reports would require a massive amount of power and a large piece of equipment, not something easily concealed in a van or an adjacent apartment. Furthermore, no remnants of any such device were ever found. No acoustic signals were ever definitively captured and analyzed. The sonic weapon remained a powerful, compelling ghost in the machine, a theory that explained everything and yet was supported by no direct physical evidence. It was, in a way, the perfect weapon for an unsolvable mystery. As the medical and technical investigations struggled to find a concrete cause, another, more unsettling possibility began to take root. This theory turned away from foreign adversaries and advanced weaponry and looked inward into the intricate and often mysterious workings of the human mind. Could Havana syndrome be at its core a psychological phenomenon? Not a simple case of malingering or making things up, but a genuine, powerful manifestation of physical symptoms born from psychological distress. This was the theory of mass psychogenic illness, a condition where a group of people, often under immense stress, begin to experience similar physical ailments without an organic cause. The environment in which these diplomats and spies worked was one of high stakes and constant pressure. They lived under the perpetual threat of surveillance in a country with a long history of hostility toward the United States. This baseline of stress is a fertile ground for anxiety. The theory suggests that the first few cases, perhaps triggered by a genuine but benign environmental anomaly like a faulty listening device or even unusually loud crickets, created a seed of fear. This fear, amplified by the close-knit and insular nature of the diplomatic community, spread like a contagion. The belief that they were under attack became a self-fulfilling prophecy. In this view, the symptoms were no less real. The headaches, the nausea, the cognitive fog, they were all genuinely experienced by the victims. The brain, under the influence of extreme stress and suggestion, can produce profound physical effects. This is the basis of the nocebo effect, the evil twin of the placebo, where the expectation of harm can create actual negative symptoms. The initial reports of strange sounds and sickness could have created a template of expectation. Subsequent personnel, hyper-vigilant and anxious, might misinterpret ambiguous sounds or common physical feelings, a headache, a moment of dizziness, as evidence that they too were being attacked. This explanation, however, has been met with significant resistance, particularly from the victims themselves. To them, it feels like a dismissal of their suffering, an accusation that it's all in their heads. Furthermore, it struggles to account for the objective medical evidence. While stress can cause a wide range of physical symptoms, can it produce the specific white matter changes observed in the brains of some patients? Can it explain the cases where family pets also reportedly fell ill? The psychological angle adds another layer of horror to the story, the idea that our own minds could betray us so completely, turning fear into a physical weapon. It leaves the victims trapped between an invisible enemy without and a potential traitor within. When conventional science and medicine fail to provide a satisfactory answer, the human imagination often turns to the fringes, to the spaces where the known world gives way to stranger possibilities. The case of Havana syndrome is no exception. As the mystery deepened and with no culprit or weapon in sight, theories began to emerge that strayed far from the realms of espionage and psychogenic illness. They tiptoed into the unsettling territory of the paranormal. The experiences of the victims, after all, bore a striking resemblance to classic ghost stories and accounts of supernatural encounters. An invisible presence, strange sounds in the night, a feeling of being watched, and unexplained physical ailments. Some observers and amateur sleuths, particularly in online forums dedicated to the unexplained, began to draw parallels. Could the attacks be a form of modern haunting, one that science was not yet equipped to understand? The directional nature of the sounds, the way they seem to follow people, the pressure changes in the air, these are all elements found in tales of poltergeist activity. Perhaps the energy was not from a man-made device, but from something else entirely, a localized, non-sentient psychic disturbance, or even a deliberate psychic attack by an individual with extraordinary abilities. It sounds like fiction, but in the absence of evidence, all theories occupy a similar space of speculation. This line of thinking often intersects with conspiracy theories involving secret government programs. For decades, rumors have circulated about clandestine research into parapsychology, remote viewing and psychokinesis, such as the CIA's Stargate project. Could Havana syndrome be the result of a field test for a new kind of psychic weapon? A method of causing physical harm through focused mental energy? This theory, while wild, neatly sidesteps the physical limitations of a sonic device. A psychic attack would require no large equipment, and would leave no conventional traces. It would be the ultimate deniable weapon, its very existence protected by the wall of mainstream scientific skepticism. Of course, there is not a shred of verifiable evidence to support any paranormal explanation. These ideas exist purely in the realm of conjecture, fueled by the lack of a better answer. Yet they persist because they speak to the primal horror of the situation. The events in Havana felt fundamentally wrong, transgressing the normal rules of reality. The idea of a ghost or a psychic attack, while fantastical, captures the feeling of being assaulted by something incomprehensible. It acknowledges the deeply personal and uncanny nature of the victim's experiences in a way that clinical, detached scientific theories sometimes fail to do. The paranormal angle is the ultimate expression of the mystery's depth. The problem is so strange, perhaps the answer must be equally strange. The horror that began in Havana did not stay there. As the world became aware of the mysterious affliction, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The phenomenon started to appear in other locations around the globe like a silent, spreading contagion. Reports surfaced from China, where a United States consulate employee in Guangzhou reported symptoms strikingly similar to those of the Havana diplomats in 2018. The eerie symphony of strange sounds, pressure, and debilitating neurological effects had crossed the Pacific Ocean. The United States State Department issued a health alert for its citizens in China, expanding the geography of fear. The list of locations grew longer and more alarming. Reports trickled in from United States personnel stationed in Russia, Poland, Georgia, and Taiwan. The incidents were no longer confined to countries with historically tense relationships with the United States. Reports emerged from friendly nations including Austria and Germany. In Vienna, a major hub for international diplomacy and intelligence, more than 24 United States officials were struck down by the mysterious ailment. The attack seemed to follow American diplomats, intelligence officers, and even their families wherever they went. It was a global hunt conducted by an invisible predator. Even Washington, D.C. was not immune. In a shocking twist, incidents were reported on American soil. One of the most prominent occurred near the White House itself, where a National Security Council official was reportedly struck by the phenomenon while walking to their car. The idea that this invisible weapon could be deployed in the heart of the United States Capitol, just steps from the seat of executive power, was a terrifying escalation. The sanctuary was gone. The threat was no longer something that happened over there in distant embassies. It was here at home. The paranoia, once confined to overseas posts, had come ashore. This global spread made the investigation exponentially more complex. It ruled out localized environmental factors specific to Havana. It suggested a portable, transmissible threat, one that could be deployed with precision in a variety of environments. With each new case, the pressure on the United States government mounted. Lawmakers and victims' advocates demanded answers and action. A 2021 law, the Havana Act, was passed to provide better financial and medical support for the growing number of victims. The legislation was a formal acknowledgement of a grim reality. The United States was facing a persistent global health and security crisis, and it still had no idea who or what was behind it. Today is August 30th, 2025. Nearly a decade has passed since the first metallic shriek echoed through a diplomat's residence in Havana, and yet the mystery remains as deep and unsettling as ever. Despite years of investigation by the nation's top intelligence agencies, medical experts and scientists, no definitive explanation has been universally accepted. The case of Havana syndrome has become a landscape of competing theories, each with its own advocates and detractors. The official United States intelligence community assessment, updated in 2023, concluded that it was very unlikely that a foreign adversary was responsible for the widespread incidents, a finding that left many victims feeling abandoned and betrayed. This conclusion has not quelled the debate. Many, including a significant number of those directly affected, still firmly believe they were targeted by a sophisticated energy weapon. They point to the specificity of their experiences, the medical evidence of brain injury, and the strategic pattern of the incidents as proof that cannot be dismissed. For them, The suggestion of a psychological cause or environmental factors feels like an institutional failure to face a terrifying new reality of modern warfare. They are left in a painful limbo, their injuries questioned and their credibility doubted by the very government they served. The story of Havana syndrome has become a modern cautionary tale. It is a story about the vulnerability of the human body and mind, and the limits of our scientific understanding. It exists in the grey space between the known and the unknown, a persistent, low-grade static in our perception of the world. The sounds may have faded for some, but the consequences endure. Lives have been permanently altered. Careers have been cut short. A cloud of paranoia now hangs over the world of diplomacy and intelligence, where every unexplained headache or strange noise carries a new and sinister weight. The horror of Havana syndrome is not just in the initial assault, but in its unresolved nature. It is the ultimate ghost story for the 21st century, a haunting with no ghost, a crime with no weapon, and a wound with no clear cause. The trail has gone cold, but the fear remains, the static endures. And in quiet rooms, in embassies and homes around the world, people still listen to the silence, wondering if and when the sound might come again. The mystery is not over. It has simply faded back into the shadows, waiting.